in theory, someday Tenet will be released in theaters. In anticipation, I'm reviewing each and every Christopher Nolan movie in release order. Today, we're discussing the movie that made him a living legend, The Dark Knight. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your take on The Dark Knight. Now, this is one of the most celebrated comic book movies of all time. It's a movie that introduced a bunch of you to Christopher Nolan and made you love these characters more. So let's have a fun discussion about this film, or if you didn't like it, if you think it's overrated, let us know down below as well. Let's just keep it respectful. As we go into this is a spoiler review. I'm assuming everyone has seen this movie, so you can spoil away, I'm gonna spoil away, and if you haven't seen the movie, go watch it, then come back and join the discussion over here. One final thing before we get started, people ask me about where I get my posters and my Funkos, what equipment I use. I've got a link down below. It'll kind of share with you all the stuff I have and where you can pick it up yourself. And let's get started talking about the background for this film. So it's a very common misconception that Christopher Nolan planned out The Dark Knight while making Batman Begins. And there's a reason that people have this misconception. One of the final scenes in Batman Begins is Batman and Gordon talking. Gordon presents this idea of escalation, and then he pulls out a Joker card and teases that the Joker has showed up in town. And because of this, obviously it seemed like Nolan was laying the groundwork for the next film, and that it actually is the direction that things went. But Christopher Nolan has been very, very open in interviews claiming the exact opposite.
It was very important to me that we never even talk or think about doing another film. It's like, okay, we put everything we've got into Batman Begins. We make the best film we know how to make.
This is what Christopher Nolan told Empire Online. I didn't have any intention of making a sequel to Batman Begins, and I was quite surprised to find myself wanting to do it. I just got caught up in the process of imagining how you would see a character like the Joker through the prism of what we did in the first film.
Then you react to that and you say, okay, you know what? I want to see who that Joker's going to be. The Joker card flipped over at the end of Batman Begins. I want to know who that's going to be. And so then you find yourself drawn into continuing the story.
Speaking to Collider, David Goyer said this: "It wasn't till about 3 or 4 months after Batman Begins opened that Chris called me up and said, let's have lunch and talk about it. Batman Begins wasn't even playing in theaters anymore by the time we talked about a second one." So Christopher Nolan, David Goyer, and Jonathan Nolan started trying to hammer out the story. And Christopher Nolan's take on it was always he wanted to take these extraordinary characters to an ordinary world. And for that reason, he almost wanted to do a genre shift and heavily focus on making the second film a crime story. Jonathan Nolan told Collider this: "I'd been watching a lot of The Wire, and Heat was always one of my favorite movies. It felt like all of these things plugged together, but David and Chris came up with the story. But I feel like everyone was converging on the same place. I mean, the criminal aspect of The Long Halloween, a little bit of Batman Year One, some of the more interesting aspects of it, the idea of a conventional criminal class as the setting for the Joker to kind of emerge." When it came to bringing a new version of the Joker to the big screen, Nolan actually wasn't nervous at all. This is what he had to say: "I had no reservations about following Jack Nicholson's Joker, and that was very important to us deciding to do it. I certainly knew that story-wise, the character was going to be very different. Our version of the Joker was drawn very much from the earliest of the comics. Really the first couple of the stories where the Joker appeared."
One of the fun things about writing on The Dark Knight was we got all the way through the drafts and realized that neither my brother nor myself had read the first appearance of the Joker. I went back, happened to go back and look at it, and I couldn't believe it, but it had so many story beats that were the same as the film that we just written. So that's when we knew we had sort of done honor to this.
Batman was always a dark character.
Always.
Other influences on their version of the Joker were, of course, the Killing Joke graphic novel from Alan Moore, in particular, the ambiguous backstory for the Joker. But then in addition to that, they spent a lot of time looking at Alex from A Clockwork Orange and kind of this psychopath that's presented there, and how could they infuse that into the main villain inside of a comic book movie. Nolan had known Ledger for years and had wanted to work with him. He even even met with him about playing Batman in Batman Begins, but it was Ledger who actually approached Christopher Nolan with his pitch for the Joker and how he would tackle the role.
And so I was sort of surprised to get the call, because it really more came from his end about wanting to get involved, wanting to talk to me about what we would be doing.
And their ideas were kind of right in line with one another. As they continued to kind of develop the script and what they were going to do for the Joker, Heath Ledger was very much involved in coming up with the look. He wanted to apply his own makeup. He was a key piece in bringing this version of the Joker to the big screen beyond just the performance.
So he developed the look of the character with Lindy Hemming, the costume designer, with John Caglione, the makeup, and myself over a long period of time.
Now, of course, Heath Ledger tragically passed away before the film came out. This led to a lot of internet speculation that maybe playing the Joker drove him mad and that led to his death. There's not a lot of evidence for that. It's just a lot of internet rumors and baseless speculation and tasteless speculation as well. In fact, in interviews, Heath Ledger said playing the Joker was the most fun role he ever had.
What was that experience like, playing the Joker?
It was awesome. Yeah, it was the most fun I've had playing a character, hands down.
Upon release, it was a massive box office and critical success. In fact, it made about twice as much money as Batman Begins had made, and it got rave reviews from critics. To this day, it's regarded as one of the greatest comic book movies of all time, one of the most influential comic book movies of all time. And Heath Ledger ended up winning the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his role in this film. From there, let's move on to the good. What makes this movie so special is that it manages to have all the spectacle that you want from a blockbuster, all the heroics that are demanded of the comic book movie genre, but it also has complex, broken characters, a plot that has multiple layers to it that involves actual moral dilemmas, and it doesn't just give safe, easy answers. Actions have consequences. Heroes do bad things. Bad guys sometimes are right. And so it never gives you a simple path to be on, and it forces you to kind of tackle all of the dimensions of it. Almost everything has multiple layers to it. And while it gives you everything that you want from a movie like this, it also challenges what you expect. So a prime example of this is that the movie has deep themes about consequences, escalation, and what it means to be a hero. How does this play out in the movie? Bruce Wayne wants to save his city, but he also wants to stop being Batman to be with Rachel, and he sees Harvey as his hope to be able to clean up the city, put Harvey in place to be able to maintain the order so he can stop being Batman and be with Rachel. But through the course of this journey of being Batman, things do escalate. In his effort to work with Harvey to take down the criminal underworld, things escalate to a point in time that Joker steps into the chaos, and the victim of that is Rachel. The thing that Bruce Wayne was doing all of this for, to a certain degree, was to get to Rachel. That's the thing that's taken from him. Like, that's real tragedy, that's real drama, and it's intertwining characters' motivations, their journeys, with the themes that are well established going into the film and developed as the story unfolds. But the whole movie kind of has this complexity to it, to where it's never the simple, obvious answer. So the movie presents Harvey as the best of them, this noble man trying to do the right thing, willing to sacrifice himself for others, but then he's the person that takes the Joker's bait in the second half of the film. But then when you get to the climax of the film and the Joker does the prisoner's dilemma with two different ferries, one of them literally filled with prisoners, and both the citizens and the prisoners pass the test. So it's not this one simple answer about people are good, people are bad. It's complex, it's nuanced. In order to stop the Joker, Bruce Wayne builds this massive, invasive system to be able to spy on people. In the final little sequence of the film, kind of our two remaining heroes put forward a lie in order to protect a villain for the sake of the greater good. None of it is as simple as good guy, bad guy. Everyone has weaknesses. Everyone fails a test at some point in time throughout the story, and certain people by the end redeem themselves and others don't. But no one has clean hands at the end. There is no White Knight, only a Dark Knight. One of my favorite sequences in the entire movie doesn't even involve Batman. It's during the prisoner's dilemma, and this big, gigantic, hulking guy walks up to the guard and starts talking down to him about, why haven't you done what you should have done 10 minutes ago? Everyone assumes that this guy is going to pull the switch, blow up the civilians, and the weak guard decides to hand off the trigger to him, and he just instantly throws it out the window. Because this thug knows that who he is, he knows he deserves to die, and he's willing to pay the price. So the guy that in many ways has this horrible backstory knows the right thing to do in that moment. And that's what the movie keeps doing so well. The characters all have multiple dimensions to them. Hardened criminal knows the right thing to do. White Knight, Harvey Dent, fails his test and turns into a villain. In a totally different direction, on a production level, this film feels much, much bigger. And there's a real practical reason for that, is that for this film, they decided to shoot on real locations. Batman Begins was largely shot on sound stages, and even if you have a massive sound stage, you're still just inside of a building. For this film, they got IMAX cameras, they went to Chicago, and they started trying to film a city. Likewise, much more of this film is shot during the daytime, and so you get the vibe of a real living city. Right out of the gate, the movie kicks off with this heist sequence involving the Joker, and they just use these huge shots to establish the city, which makes the sequence itself very cool and awesome to look at, but it also just establishes the scope of the film. And as you kind of go throughout it, there's all of these just massive establishing shots, whereas in Batman Begins, a lot of that stuff was CGI. Here it's a real place. And so when they cut to a street parade, it feels real because it is real. And I think this was so important because they were trying to tell this more grounded crime story that still had all these fantastical elements. And so by going to a real place, it created something that made it more immersive, that you could buy into the world and that these fantastical characters would appear in it. Another thing I really enjoyed about this film is you get just a little bit of Bruce Wayne as the great detective. It's not as much on the forefront as I would like, but it's sprinkled throughout the story to show that it's there. Like right at the beginning of the film, you have Bruce Wayne through this deal that he's negotiating, using that to investigate this company and claiming it's under doing due diligence, but it's actually him doing a criminal investigation for his work as Batman. Later in the film, he starts like cutting out bullet holes and doing investigations and doing multiple tests with different types of bullets to be able to kind of investigate fingerprints and stuff like that. It's detective work, which is what Batman is known for, but the movies haven't always emphasized this much, and they got just a little bit of that in here. Couple other positive things. Much like Batman Begins, the film uses Alfred and Lucius Fox to add in just a little bit of humor, add some levity, cut the tension just a little bit without it going overboard, without it going too far, just the right amount of humor for the story that they're telling. The movie also does a great job of pushing the edge of the PG-13 rating by implying violence, which in its own way makes the movie even more horrifying than it would have been if they showed us what happened. There's multiple sequences where you have the Joker walking up to someone and putting a knife in their mouth. The tension builds and then it cuts away. There's a large crash sound, so you know he just did something horrible that killed the person, but it's all left up to your imagination, which is usually a lot more powerful and potent than showing us cartoonish violence like right there on the screen. And in its own way, I think the PG-13 limitation actually makes the movie more terrifying in other ways in certain sequences because of that. Moving along, I thought the car chase sequence in this film was much better than the car chase in Batman Begins. If you watched my review of Batman Begins, I criticized that film for the sequence having Batman driving on top of buildings and stuff like that being almost as silly as the idea of Batman driving up a wall that he did in the Schumacher films. And you have Batman like blowing up police cars and having them flip over, and it just seems so reckless for Batman to do that. I know he's early in his career, but that just seems out of character for him to put those officers in danger. This sequence I thought was more exciting and made a lot more sense, and they shot it in IMAX, and they designed the whole sequence to just have these gorgeous wide shots of practical stunt work, of cars actually being flipped, of having a semi flip over, explosions that actually happen, cars moving back and forth, dodging things, all shot with pristine IMAX. So the shots are massive, they're gorgeous, you can see everything that is happening in it, and designed for maximum excitement. And of course, you have to talk about the cast. Of course, Heath Ledger is a legend for his performance as the Joker, and I'll talk about him in just a second. But because that role was so iconic and the tragedy surrounding his death such a big news story, I think very much so Aaron Eckhart's performance as Harvey and Two-Face gets overlooked. But for that role, he had to play the White Knight, who could be this DA that's willing to do hard things, willing to sacrifice himself. Then you see him as this broken man watching as he knows that the love of his life is going to die in front of him, and then it turns him evil. He has to portray all of that. So many different layers and emotions, and he absolutely sells you on each and every aspect of Harvey and Two-Face. But of course, the performance you have to talk about is Heath Ledger as the Joker, and I can confirm all the backlash was real. When they announced that the star of 10 Things I Hate About You was going to be the new Joker, people went bananas. And the simple reason for that is that nobody could see this teen heartthrob as the Joker. And that's actually exactly why the performance works so well. You do not see Heath Ledger, the teen heartthrob. You see the Joker. He disappeared into the performance. And that's what great performances are, where you stop seeing the actor and you just see the character. His speech, his voice, his mannerisms, his quirks, the licking of the lips. That was Joker, and all the Heath Ledger was gone. And it was an actual performance because it wasn't just, oh yeah, you know, Heath Ledger doing his thing, playing the Joker. No, no, no. All the Heath Ledgerisms gone. All this new character of Joker is what you saw. And so almost our expectations for what Heath Ledger would be as the Joker helped the performance be so good because we didn't get any of that. Whatever we imagined when we first heard the news, we did not see that. We saw this new, terrifying character where he was able to go between these subtle little Joker jokes that he makes to this horrifying act in killing someone all in a moment. And so he could be funny while also being terrifying. There's a lot of discussion about what makes for a great villain, and normally it comes down to a character with a layered backstory that gives them a clear motivation, and while their actions are villainous, we understand why they're doing what they're doing. Thanos is an example of this, that he's seen overpopulation, so he comes up with this crazy idea that's villainous, but in his own mind, he's the hero saving the galaxy. But what makes this version of the Joker so interesting is that it defies all those normal expectations for a great villain. He doesn't have a backstory. He has 5 backstories that probably none of them are true. His motivation is just chaos. He's not out there for the purpose of achieving a clear, normal objective inside of a movie like this. He exists as the counterbalance to the hero. And that's what makes him interesting. He defies all the normal rules of a great villain while still being a great villain with a great performance and a compelling characterization. When you put it all together, you get a movie that delivers everything the genre demands while also transcending the genre with complex characters and a story that challenges our understanding of the genre as a whole. And the cherry on top is an iconic Oscar-winning performance from Heath Ledger. Now, while I think that this movie is fantastic, I think sometimes people over-elevate it and they want to diminish some of the faults that it does have. So I gotta be fair with my review, so let's move on to the mixed aspects of the film. And the first thing that comes to mind here is the fight choreography. Now, if you watched my review of Batman Begins, you know that I mentioned the fight choreography and the way they were filmed as one of the big negatives for that film. It's a movie that spends the first hour showing Bruce Wayne learning how to fight, and then when he becomes Batman, it becomes time to show us these fights. It's all cut to pieces, cameras moving, obstacles are blocking things, and so you can't really even see any of the fight choreography in it. This movie, they very intentionally changed the way they tackled things. When it came to Batman Begins, they were trying to show the fights from the perspective of criminals, and because of that, they're just chaotic and cut to pieces. With this movie, they intentionally tried to show you the actual choreography.
We decided in this film that it was going to be necessary to show more of the way in which Batman fights. The KC system that we applied to his method of fighting in the first film was somewhat obscured by the way in which we chose to present the character, which was from the criminal's point of view. So in the first film, you're always catching glimpses of Batman.
So right off the bat, I think the fights in this movie are better than the fights in Batman Begins. There's 2 key aspects to a great movie fight. First one, you have to have interesting, cool fight choreography. Second, you have to film the sequence in a way that makes it exciting, where you can see what's happening. Batman Begins, I understand why Nolan did what he did, but I don't think it fully serves the movie for the best for the most part by consistently doing choppy editing for all these fight sequences. This movie much improves the way the fights are filmed, and so they've zoomed back the camera so you can see what's happening. It's longer takes so you can see the fight choreography. But I think still here, the fight choreography itself isn't as strong as it probably should be in light of Batman being this highly trained fighter, and the fighting method system they went with, the KC method. On all the demo stuff that they show you on the Batman Begins special features, it looks much cooler than what Batman actually does in this movie. And you see these guys moving quickly, throwing elbows and breaking limbs and stuff like that. When you get to this movie, it just feels a lot more like he's just throwing solid punches. And I wonder how much of that is just the limitations of the suit, how much of that is the nature of the environments they were in, and how much of that was just Christopher Nolan's own aversion to anything that feels too dance-like or choreographed. But I don't think that Nolan came up with the best choreography here. And I'm not alone in this. I was actually able to interview Sam Hartgrove, who directed the movie Extraction. He was the stunt coordinator for Endgame. He was Chris Evans' stunt double in Captain America Winter Soldier. He's the guy in the elevator for the elevator fight. And I talked with him, and he called out The Dark Knight's fight choreography.
It was one of my favorite comic book movies ever, and I'm not bagging it. I love it. But it's like The Dark Knight, for example. It's a great movie, personally, there's certain things with action that I would have liked to see a little differently with Batman.
Yes.
But
So while I do think that this movie is an improvement on the fights that we saw in Batman Begins, I still don't think the fights themselves are up to par with the movie. Second kind of mixed aspect here is that this is very much a Nolanized version of Batman.
I mean, these are characters who've been beloved for decades, and they've been reinterpreted and worked on by great artists and writers and other filmmakers, over the years. And so that's very frightening, because you're saying, okay, I'm going out there and I'm saying, I've got a version of this that's going to be different. I've got a version of this that is worthwhile. Then you've got to really deliver the goods on that.
Because people love the film and they love the trilogy and they love Christopher Nolan, a lot of times want to perceive of this, oh, this is the definitive version of Batman. Oh, it's such a true translation of the comic books to the movies. Parts are. There's also a whole lot of interpretation, translation, and just all new ideas. I mean, if you just stop and think about it, like the central premise of this movie is that Bruce Wayne wants to get together with his high school girlfriend. So he wants to take out organized crime, put in Harvey Dent so he can retire as Batman.
He's somebody who's looking for an out. He doesn't want to keep doing this forever, It's not good for his personal life. What is good for Batman, it tends to be terrible for Bruce Wayne. So he's looking for an elected official who can wipe out crime and corruption, and he sees that in Harvey Dent.
When that's your kind of central motivation for your version of Batman, that feels pretty detached from the comic books. That does not feel like classic interpretation of Bruce Wayne driven by the love of the girl that he stole condensed milk with back in the day. And I wish that more fans of this movie would acknowledge that. I think it's fine for movies to have interpretation, to change things. You always, of course, have to do that. And the MCU has done that repeatedly. But with this movie in particular, it seems like a lot of people are in denial of how much they interpreted, adjusted, changed some of these characters to fit their story and to fit the themes that they wanted to explore. From there, let's move on to the bad. Now, as I go into this, I'm approaching it from the perspective that this is one of the most highly praised films of its genre. Some people call it a masterpiece. Some people call it one of the best movies ever made. And so the level of detail I'm paying attention to is heightened because that is the category where this movie is being discussed. Some people would call that nitpicking. I just think it's giving a fair and honest take on a movie that's sometimes discussed as if it has absolutely no faults. First off, I think the movie has a few more gaps in its logic, conveniences, in unfinished plot threads than some people acknowledge. Key example of this would be the fundraiser sequence where Joker shows up, throws Rachel out a window, Batman jumps out after her, catches her, and uses his body and a car to soften the fall. Right off the bat, that feels like a little bit of a stretch to me. But more importantly, up in the loft, the Joker is still there. He's still holding a room full of people hostage, and the script and story just moves on, as if there was a deleted scene there, or that they just forgot, hey, we need to close out this sequence and explain how this ends, and that there's things that are important beyond just, did Rachel die? That's an unanswered question that's important. It's a dangling plot thread. Beyond that, Joker's plot to get captured, it's kind of one of these common tropes in these movies that it's all part of the plan. The villain wants to get captured so that they can do something. And typically one of the big gigantic problems with these types of plot lines is that they require an enormous number of conveniences where everything has to fit perfectly into place in order for the exact results to play out. So you have a situation where Joker's captured, makes sense. He's interrogated by Batman, fantastic sequence. But then kind of everything that happens once they leave, in order for Rachel to die, to set up the third act, and for us to get Two-Face, there's just so many things that have to happen that Joker couldn't have predicted, that he couldn't have anticipated that they would have left a guard in the room that he'd be able to manipulate and manhandle him at just the right time to be able to make a phone call. Like the amount of time it would take Batman versus the police to drive to certain locations. There's so much convenience in that. There's so much that only happens that way because the script demands it. And I understand some of that is required for movies like this. There's a lot demanded in that sequence. Couple of smaller things. I don't like that we have skinny Batman in this movie. Christian Bale's clearly like 20 pounds lighter than he was in Batman Begins. When you see the training sequences in Batman Begins, he looks like a thick brawler. When you see him on the yacht and he jumps in the water, he's leaned down quite a bit. And for the nature of the character that's this guy that just spends his time brawling, part of that for me to believe that I have to see this guy as someone that can take a bunch of guys in a fight, and I buy it a whole lot more with the Batman Begins physique than the Dark Knight physique. Second, kind of maybe more of nitpicks here, because there were multiple sequences shot in IMAX, it does some aspect ratio hopping when you watch it. I don't like it when movies do that. I find it distracting. I certainly notice when my screen is doing this, especially mid-sequence when you're watching it and it does this. So like when the hospital explodes, you're watching it and you'll have these wide shots of Heath Ledger walking out. It cuts to inserts of kids on a bus and it's tight, cuts back to Heath Ledger and it goes big. And that pulls me out of the experience when I'm noticing the size of the screen change constantly. And finally, I think that Two-Face's plotline works thematically better than structurally. We have to have Harvey's downfall and descent into villainy in order to set up the final sequence of the movie and this concept of Batman being the Dark Knight that has to do hard things, that has to tell this lie to perpetuate the legend that is Harvey. Thematically, it works. It feels really clunky in the way it plays out in the movie, because in the story, we're just so invested in Bruce Wayne trying to stop Joker and him being so broken over the loss of Rachel that the Two-Face plotline it's just kind of this other thing off over here that's just kind of happening. And so we have the big victory where Joker is defeated, and then it's like, oh yeah, we have to resolve that other thing too. And so suddenly we have this tacked on sequence where Two-Face has kidnapped Gordon's family that even the way it's designed, I've never fully buy that there wasn't an alternative situation of here, how it could have played out, that this is the time where Batman can't figure something out to save the people and save Two-Face at the same time. It's just the pieces do not fit together right for me on a structural level. Thematically, I get why it's there. Thematically, it sets up this amazing, amazing final 2 minutes for the movie. In the moments, though, the way that it's written, that's some of the weakest written aspects of the film for me, of how the actual Two-Face plotline played out. And I wish there would have been some way that we could get that final 2 minutes and at the same time save Two-Face for another movie to really let his story play out a little bit better. Even at the most basic level of Two-Face's motivation, I don't understand why he seems like he's able to be convinced to not go after Joker and kind of team up with him, but he feels he has to go after Gordon's family. I don't think they built that bridge enough to get me to that point in time to see him as turning that evil in this amount of time. But as I said before, my point here isn't that this is a bad movie, but this is a movie that is one of the best of the genres, and therefore it has to be held to a higher standard when dissecting the specifics. Still, obviously a fantastic film. Real quick before I give you my final score on this one, be sure to tell me what you thought down below. Is this one of your favorite comic book movies of all time? Are you one of the people that thinks that it's kind of overrated? Also, remember, I'm reviewing each of the Nolan movies leading up to Tenet. You can check them out right here in this playlist. The Dark Knight is absolutely one of the best films of this genre, and their ambitions were sky high. And while I don't think they fully reached their ambitions. This is an incredible film that you must watch. Overall, it's an A. On the entertainment scale, it's a 9.5. And of course, you must watch The Dark Knight. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out the rest of my Christopher Nolan reviews right over there. You can check out some of my Batman rankings right down there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.